want to welcome you to the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast. This podcast is coming out of the Trauma Informed Educators Network Facebook group. I am so looking forward to talking to people globally about their trauma-informed journey. As the principal of Fall Hamilton Elementary School, a trauma-informed school in Nashville, Tennessee, I have learned that this is not a destination, and it truly is a process of learning and adjusting. So this podcast will be speaking to guests all over the world about people who are just starting their journeys and people have been on this journey for many, many years. So I hope you enjoy our guests. I hope you learned something just as I am. And welcome to the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast. All right, Dr. Greene, how are you today? I have to thank you for taking time out of your, I know, busy schedule to be on the podcast. So how are you today?
You know, under the current circumstances, I would say I am doing about as well as a person could possibly be doing.
You know, I tell a lot of people I'm insanely optimistic most of the time, but it's been quite the, what I call journey of grief, of going what is happening and identifying that and going where you are in that space is, to me, is really important. So, but I know a lot of people are really excited to hear from you, and I know I'm excited to chat with you. So I don't want to waste a whole lot of time other than tell us about you. Tell us about where you are in your journey and your writing and research and all of that great stuff.
Well, child psychologist, currently based in Portland, Maine. But I've been working with and trying to help kids with social, emotional, and behavioral challenges for over 40 years now. Over time, I've developed this model that I now call collaborative and proactive solutions. It has been an extremely exciting journey. I started by implementing the model with families, but then moved on to prisons, schools and inpatient psychiatry units and residential facilities, and now using the model with adults in prisons and in inpatient psychiatric facilities. It's been quite the journey. I spend most of my time thinking about how can I get this information into people's hands in a way that we haven't done it yet. Because I was talking to someone from the United Kingdom this morning, and they were saying, how do we get this information in people's hands? And I said, you know what? There's no way that we haven't tried. But there are some people who are readers, so there's books. There's some people who are listeners, there's podcasts. Some people are watchers, there's webinars. Some people want to do it in social media, there's Facebook groups, there's you name it, right? So, and whenever I can do it for free, I do it for free because that's the ultimate level of accessibility. And so these days, a lot of my efforts are devoted to my nonprofit, Lives in the Balance, where we are advocating on behalf of behaviorally challenging kids and their caregivers and trying to heighten people's awareness about what's really going on with these kids and the archaic, counterproductive things we still do to them in the name of discipline. The most recent effort along those lines has been our documentary film called The Kids We Lose. If people want to know more about that, that's thekidswelose.com. That's where we basically wanted to do an expose. It's a 90-minute feature-length documentary film. It's won a bunch of awards already, which is kind of cool. But the main goal was not to win awards. The main goal was to heighten awareness of what we are still doing to kids, merely because of their behavioral challenges, still in the year 2020, despite all that we know about what's going on with them and what they really need from us. There you have my life in a minute and a half.
You know, that's pretty impressive because I don't think I could squeeze mine, and I haven't done nearly what you have. But I think something powerful that you just said is what we do to kids. And I can tell you the transformation for myself started when I realized I was doing two things to kids instead of for and with kids. And so that resonated with me. And I want to dig into, you mentioned the archaic ideas of discipline. Talk through that process of why we've done what we've done and the idea of modifying behavior as opposed to problem solving?
Well, I don't want to offend anybody who is keen on using rewards and punishments to modify behavior. What they will say to me is that there's research telling us, and a lot of it telling us, that when you are applying rewards and punishments to a kid's behavior, the behavior often improves. They do have a durability issue. Often the behavior returns to baseline once the program is removed. So they've got a durability issue. But my bigger issue, I was trained in rewarding and punishing, so I don't really want to trash that approach. I'm actually kind of glad I was trained that way in the beginning. It's not what I do anymore. The problem, I think, is that rewarding and punishing is focused on the wrong thing. Rewarding and punishing is aimed at modifying behavior. But by my way of thinking, behavior is just the signal, just the fever, just the means by which the kid is communicating something very important that we don't want to miss. I'm stuck. There are expectations I'm having difficulty meeting. In my view, that's all behavior is. So I get it. You've got to manage a classroom. There's certain behaviors you can't tolerate. That doesn't mean we should be focused on the signal, the fever, the way the kid is communicating. So that's what rewarding and punishing is good at doing, modifying behavior. But if all we're doing is modifying behavior, then all we're doing is modifying the signal, and we have missed the most important part. What is the expectation the kid is having difficulty meeting, and what's making it hard for the kid to meet that expectation? Rewarding and punishing will never accomplish that for us, and was not designed to accomplish that for us. So my biggest issue with reward and punishment programs, aside from the fact that the kids who are rewarding and punishing the most are the ones who seem to be benefiting from the least, aside from that, it's focused on the wrong thing. Educators have always been problem solvers. Why we put on completely different lenses when the kid is communicating that there is a problem through behaviors that we don't like is beyond me. I get it. We've got to manage this classroom. We can't let them disrupt the learning of others. They're not going to be disrupting the learning of others. If we identify the expectations they're having difficulty meeting, in my work, we call those unsolved problems, and we are busy solving those problems with those students, you're still not going to have the classroom disruption. But what experience tells me is that if all we're doing is modifying behavior, the problems that are causing those behaviors remain unsolved. So while you might make a dent in the behavior, you've solved nothing. And as many people in high school and middle schools well know, those problems, if they remain unidentified and unsolved, simply stack up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, I reread your book recently, and there was something that just stuck out and resonated with me, and it was, you know, the effect of zero tolerance on schools, you know, which also is directly correlated with the assessment pushes and testing pushes. And you mentioned that, you know, by no fault of ours, educators have become punishing robots. And I agree with that, right? It's a systematic flaw that we know is in education. So as someone who identifies myself as an unapologetic disruptor, because I think it's important, what would you tell us, me, and others out there that are trying to disrupt the system? What would you tell us about disruption, and how do we go about it in a way, because we have the research and that hasn't changed anything. We have better methods. Those haven't been taken on. So what do you say?
Use the data that are available to you in your school. Got a few different types of data that are going to help you. First of all, it's the same, depending on the size of your school, it's the same 10, 20, 30 kids in your building who are accounting for 80 to 90% of the disciplinary referrals. Proof that all those disciplinary referrals are not working. How could they? Second, use your data, because it's not just the kids who are being sent to the office who are frequent flyers. It's the folks who are sending them who are frequent flyers as well. So this becomes a staff development issue. right? You know, we've gone through interesting revolutions in education. 30 years ago, we might have thought that kids who were having difficulty reading were lazy, dumb, stupid. No one says that anymore. We need a similar revolution when it comes to behavior. This is not attention-seeking, manipulative, coercive, unmotivated, limit testing. This is a kid who has lagging skills and has expectations that they're having difficulty meeting. And so if, you know, I think that zero tolerance didn't make it easier because it memorialized basically just coming up with a list of signals, behaviors that kids are not allowed to exhibit, and then an algorithm of adult-imposed consequences that were going to be applied if a kid should exhibit any of those signals. Completely misses. There's expectations that are causing this signal. There are expectations this kid's having difficulty meeting. No reward, no punishment is going to solve that problem. But I also think that there are people who still philosophically somehow justify punitive intervention as the means to get a kid on the straight and narrow path, right? The expressions like he just needs a good kick in the butt. I got to tell you, the kids I've been working with for the last 40 years are the kids who've been kicked in the butt more than any other kid in society. If a kick in the butt was going to get the job done, would have gotten the job done a long time ago. These are the most overcorrected, over-directed, over-punished kids in our society. Interestingly, if you don't have the kid for more than a year, and of course this is the setup in schools, then you may not have that historical perspective. And therefore, you don't know that this kid has been over-punished for the last 3 or 4 years. By the way, back in my training days, when I was a reward and punishment guy, what was my first thought when I got a kid in who I was supposed to be helping in a family, and the parents were telling me that the reward and punishment program hadn't worked? My first thought back in the day, whoever taught you how to do it must have done it wrong. I'll teach you how to do it right. Mm-hmm. So still a very popular belief system out there. Zero tolerance simply memorialized something that was very popular and shouldn't have been in the first place. Here's the deal. We've got a lot of research over the last 40 years that's accumulated telling us that these kids are lacking skills. There is zero research telling us that these kids are lacking motivation. Zero. What are we doing?
Well, and I think too, for so long, and even now, we tend to focus on the reactive approaches, the tiered interventions, but we're not really talking about the proactive approaches, right? And when you also described the overpunished, I want to add the underheard. And I say that because I was a kid that was in trouble often, but I never ever was asked, why are you so angry? Why are you so frustrated? Why? Nobody ever asked me. I just was in trouble, right? And I didn't get in bad trouble, but I just was, and I'm going to be honest, it was because I wasn't heard. And I have a student right now that's in 4th grade, and she was getting in trouble at the beginning of the year, and I asked her, tell me, what frustrates you? And number one, adults don't listen to me. And so I vowed from that moment to be her adult that listened. Even if I didn't agree, just listen. And the bond that happened was so amazing that now I can have a candid conversation and she'll take the feedback and she'll give me feedback and I'll take it. And I think that's important. But let's go back to the proactive approach, right? Talk about the importance of proactivity when you're talking about skill building and relationships and those points in school.
Well, the main piece of the proactive element is the expectations that the student is having difficulty meeting are actually highly predictable. And the key here is the expectation the student is having difficulty meeting reliably. Just because a kid can meet an expectation sometimes doesn't mean that they can meet the expectation all the time. We adults are pretty famous when we see this. I say this is the curse of kids who sometimes meet expectations, right? Automatically, we assume that because the kid can meet an expectation sometimes, they can meet the expectation all the time. And the universal adult tendency is to assume that if they can meet it sometimes, then they must be not motivated to meet it all the time.
And Dr. Greene, as an adult, I can't meet the same expectations all the time.
Right. So here's the good news. The expectations the kid is having difficulty meeting reliably are predictable. They do not pop up in the heat of the moment, thereby causing us to have to react in the heat of the moment. If we identify those problems ahead of time, proactively, and we can. In my line of work, we use an instrument called the assessment of lagging skills and unsolved problems to do it. Lagging skills are our new lenses. They take the place of lagging motivation. But people are not necessarily on the hook for teaching those lagging skills explicitly. Lagging skills are for lenses. What people are on the hook for doing is identifying the expectations the kid is having difficulty reliably meeting and engaging the kid in proactive, collaborative efforts to solve those problems. And here's what I always say. Solved problems don't cause challenging behavior. Only unsolved problems do. And there is a nutshell is the transformational shift that needs to occur in many schools. Because not only are identifying expectations the student has been having difficulty meeting proactively, not only are you solving those problems proactively, you're also doing it collaboratively. The kid is your teammate. The kid is your partner in all of this, which means the kid has voice. In the story you just told us about that fourth grader, her voice needed to be heard. But we needed to hear her voice, not only so that she could tell us she was mad because no one was listening to her, but also so she could tell us what was hard for her about completing the double-digit division problems on the worksheet in math. Because there's the information we've been missing. If all we're doing is punishing her when she flips a desk over, because once again she's had difficulty completing the double-digit division problems on the worksheet in math, and because our rubric system says you're not allowed to flip desks, we will still never know what's making it hard for her to complete those double-digit division problems on the worksheet in math. That problem will just remain unsolved. Her voice will remain unheard. I would predict that her challenging behavior would continue. Once again, what are we doing here? No one would agree more than I would that a flipped over desk is a bad thing. The key here is, I'm saying that flipped over desk occurred over an unsolved problem that's been getting in this kid's way probably for a very long time. How come we haven't figured out what those unsolved problems are yet? And how come we're not busy solving them? Because once again, it's only unsolved problems that cause flipped over desks. Solved problems don't.
And what do you say to educators when they say, because I've heard this, we don't have time. I'm not a therapist, right? And I know what I say, but what do you say when we don't have time?
We're going to have to create time. First, we're going to have to help you find buried time. Because whenever I or my colleagues are consulting with an individual teacher or a school system, we're helping them find buried time. Because the very first thing that people will frequently say, I get this, I would even try to do it. I don't have time. Good. Let's find you buried time before school, after school, during lunch, during recess, during the teacher's prep time if the teacher has prep time. In many schools, we also have to help them create systems of coverage so that teachers have time to solve problems with their students. And I've worked with schools that have just come up with some of the most exquisite coverage systems, so that if a particular teacher or administrator or school psychologist or school counselor has time to provide coverage, a classroom teacher now has time to solve problems with students. Because Lord knows we don't want to ever say that we don't have time to solve problems with our kids in this school. We never want to say that.
Well, and I think going back to what you said, it's 10, 20, 30 kids. we're not talking about
That's correct.
the majority of the kids. And we know that's clear in research, that there is a pyramid model. And what I always say is sometimes we're an upside down pyramid, and that isn't a kid problem to me. If the school is an upside down pyramid, that's an adult problem. That's not a kid problem. And that's, like you said, PD and such. So I do have one. You mentioned the ALSUP, and I have listeners that have submitted some questions, and I think this goes along with what you said, and I would love to hear your perspective. And she asked, what best ways do you feel to use the ALSUP as a tool of working collaboratively with families, a school, and the kid when there's been identified trauma and traumatic experiences? How do you see that tool meshing with kids who have experienced trauma?
I think that trauma is something I'd want to know about. And I think of trauma as one of many risk factors that can contribute to lagging skills and unsolved problems in kids. There are many other risk factors besides trauma. Trauma is not the only risk factor, although it does seem to be the one that a lot of people are talking about these days. But what a lot of people have said to me is that while they feel that they are now trauma informed, they're not exactly sure what being trauma informed tells them to do. Well, that's a problem, because it's great to view a kid through more empathic lenses. No one would argue with that, right? That's all good. But people got to know what to do, which in my world says, you still got to figure out this kid's lagging skills and unsolved problems. You still got to give the kid voice. If a traumatized kid needed anything, it would be a voice. It would be agency, right? So that's what you're doing with any kid, right? So trauma doesn't necessarily change the game any more than attachment disorder would change the game, or ADHD, or oppositional defiant disorder, or autism spectrum disorder. I still got to figure out what are this kid's lagging skills and unsolved problems. Just a quick anecdote. I was speaking in Denmark, doesn't really matter where it was, but about a year ago, and a mom was listening to me, and she said, I found my daughter's autism diagnosis to be very helpful. And I said, good. She said, but I think what you're saying is that my daughter's autism diagnosis really didn't tell me anything about her specific lagging skills or her specific unsolved problems. I said, right. She pondered it a bit further and then said, and I think what you're saying is that once I know what my kid's lagging skills and unsolved problems are, I'm going to learn that my daughter's autism diagnosis really wasn't telling me that much at all. I do want to know that a kid has a trauma history. Boy, have I seen some pretty nasty stuff done to kids in schools that were trauma informed. It can't just change our lenses, it has to change our practices.
And I think that's powerful. And I think this movement of being trauma informed has a lot of growing to do, right? Trauma it's not an event, it's the response in which an individual child has reacted or whatever, right? And some kids have experienced awful things and have resiliency and come out. And so it's the assumption that if a kid has experienced trauma, then this is the expectation. And we know that's not necessarily the case. And I think that's what you're saying with the autism spectrum. A child that is on an autism spectrum, and it is a spectrum, that doesn't tell us anything more about the child than if I say that child's name is Mike, right? So it gives us an idea, but it's interesting that you say that. And I want to get into too, when you're talking about skills and we're talking about trauma informed, because I think there's a big push around logical and natural consequences. And in your book, you stated sometimes logical consequences aren't enough, right? That there's got to be something else. Can you talk through that? And I think it's built in that collaborative piece, but I'd love to hear more.
The something else is not more consequences. That's the issue.
True.
The terminology I use is natural versus artificial consequences. Natural consequences are things that would happen just because they happen, right? They're natural consequences, and different people use natural consequences differently than I do. Natural consequences are consequences that would happen anyway. If you share your toys with Billy, he's going to want to play with you again. That is a natural reward. No sticker necessary, no clip necessary. It's going to happen. If you don't share your toys with Billy, he is not going to want to play with you. That is a natural punishment. Natural consequences are very powerful, very persuasive, inevitable, inescapable. Here's where the fork in the road occurs. Many adults think that if those very powerful, very persuasive natural consequences aren't getting the job done, then it's their job to add more. Those of the unnatural, artificial, adult-imposed variety, which, by the way, just also very powerful and very persuasive, but you just lost me. If those natural consequences that are inevitable, unavoidable, inescapable are very powerful and very persuasive, but didn't get the job done, why would we think that adding more of the unnatural, artificial, adult-imposed variety would get the job done? I don't. That's the point. I don't. I can't get the kid out of those natural consequences, but if this kid is having difficulty sharing his toys with Billy, we got us an unsolved problem. And we got to collaborate with that kid on solving that problem. And we got to figure out what's getting in that kid's way if we're going to solve that problem. The kid has agency. The kid is our partner in the problem-solving process. Why would we think that adding more consequences would accomplish any of that?
And I think, too, from a school administrator standpoint, right, that if an adult in my building makes a mistake, right, or I don't go to write-up as my number one. I don't go to, I'm going to put you in writing, and this is going to go in your file. I go to a conversation of saying, talk me through it. Let's figure out. We have a statement in our school. It's called pre-forgiveness. There's a sense of pre-forgiveness, right? We're innovative. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to make choices. We're going to make a mistake with a kid. So I think it's so interesting that so many times when we're talking about this, we're talking about the kid. And in schools, if I were to do some of the things that I've seen done, not necessarily in my school, but other schools, to kids, the staff would leave, right? Prime example, you mentioned the clip chart. You know, when I first came to our school, there were clip charts. It was the first thing I said, we're not going to do it unless you want me to use it in a faculty meeting. And every time you pull out your cell phone or you talk or you don't, then I'm going to clip you down. They looked at me like I was crazy, but that's really the context we have to put this in, right? We're working with little human beings that have the same value that we have. They have less experience, but that doesn't mean they don't have knowledge. It really is important to think about that in this regard of adult to adult and adult to kid, because it doesn't change the factor.
And I just want to add one more dimension to this. If we do not show kids how to be empathic, if we do not listen, if they do not develop empathy, then it is entirely possible that when it comes time for them to do social distancing, to protect others, if not themselves, it's entirely possible that they will say things that we see on TV, like, I don't really care what this does to me. I'm going to partay.
Yeah, it's true. And
if all doing things to kids, if all we're doing is they're doing the right thing because somebody's making them, or because then when you don't make them, later on, there's an excellent chance they're going to do the wrong thing. And they're going to look like fools doing it because they have shown an absolute utter disregard for other people.
And you're preaching to me here, because I had a rocky time between about 17 to 22, right? And it was an interesting time in my life where I I'm probably the most empathetic person right now that I could be, probably overly empathetic. And I think I had to hit a wall in my life to understand that, right? And I look back on that as a time of learning and there's a lot of people that aren't as fortunate as that, right? They don't learn from that. And it's a vortex that it could be life altering and honestly life ending, but it's true. And when we talk about kids don't have empathy, right? I hear it all the time. Kids don't have empathy. What you're just saying is we have to model it and we have to teach that skill, not just expect it.
And you have to give them as much opportunity for practicing it in a classroom. You have to build it into your curriculum. There's all kinds of things kids could read when they have time to read. Why not have them read something about people being empathic toward each other? Why not have them read things about accepting each other and individual differences? Lots of things they could read. This is all about building those skills into our curriculum, because I'm not letting parents off the hook here, by the way. Parents are on the hook too. But I always tell educators, you got the kid 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, 9 months a year. You could be teaching a lot of empathy in 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, 9 months of the year, if you build it in. That's why a lot of school systems are moving towards social emotional learning. I'm not necessarily so invested in what I would call a social emotional learning curriculum. I'm invested in having kids and caregivers solving problems collaboratively and proactively, a process that involves empathy. Ugh.
You're fine.
Turn this off. I can't turn it off.
You're fine.
My daughter's texting me, but it's coming in on my laptop. That's what we could be doing in our classrooms. Truth is, there's a video on the Lives in the Balance website showing full class solving a problem collaboratively. Not just one-on-one, teacher and a kid, but a full class solving a problem that affected all of them. I was amazed, never surprised, but amazed at how well these kids did at listening to each other, respecting each other, even though they might not have agreed with each other, and working toward a solution that they were all good with. Boy, did we save a lot of time by doing that, because that classroom teacher had been spending an enormous amount of time dealing with that problem day after day after day.
Well, and I think even in the work that I do every day, I find that sometimes kids are more empathetic towards other kids than sometimes the adults are. That kids can go, I get it. I know why they're upset, or I know, or I have your back. Where when given moment, the adult is the one that is lacking that empathetic listening or empathetic mindset. That kids have that. And when given the opportunity to support another kid or child, they will jump into that any and every opportunity given.
If we create an environment in which that is a good thing to do, the right thing to do, the expected thing to do, because we've modeled it, we've practiced it, and we've built it into our day every day.
And that's important. And it's those things like those morning gatherings. It's things that kids are making, those relationship-based bonds that are so important. And I even, right before all of this pandemic, and I don't know if you know, but we had a big tornado came through Nashville right before the pandemic. So it's been one thing after another. And I stopped my staff and said, I'm telling you, not only do you have time, but you have permission to do all of these pieces. The morning meetings, they're as imperative as the math lesson at the end of the day or at the beginning. It's all as important as the next.
The bad news is that that's not what we have been telling educators legislatively for a very long time now. You mentioned zero tolerance. The other fly in the ointment is high stakes testing, right? If you tell a classroom teacher that his or her job security is going to be, and job performance is going to be based on high stakes tests, then you are forcing them to focus on high stakes tests. And at the expense of a lot of other things we've always relied on classroom teachers to do, right? You truly do reap what you sow.
And we are definitely doing that. And I find that sometimes the most highest performing teachers on the assessment, whose kids perform the best, it's part of their identity, right? That I am a academically driven, can get kids results educator. And it's even harder to stop and take that time because that's not who I am. I'm a teacher of academics. And so I think you're right. The system that has been created is contributed and really created. So that leads me to a next question that I had somebody else submit, and I think it goes perfectly. And it's, how do you see the current disruption that's happening in education with this pandemic change discipline policies or education period moving forward? What do you see as an opportunity, I should say?
Well, number one, I think that there are a lot of parents out there who are now extremely appreciative of what goes on at school. So if there's a silver lining, that might be it. When we come back, I fear that because of the feeling that we've lost time academically, that we're going to come back and hit it even harder. When in fact, what this whole situation teaches me is that we are a community. We are dependent on each other. My neighbors are dependent on me socially distancing. I am dependent on them socially distancing. The cliche is we're in this together. The problem is we just frequently don't act that way. So I think it could break in both of those directions and probably will. Different places, some folks are going to feel like they've got to hit the academics even harder because the kids have lost ground. And some folks are going to take a step back and say, what did we learn from this? What do we want school to be now that we haven't been together for a very long time? Isn't school just as much about hearing what kids' experiences were, hearing what they've been through? Because let there be no doubt, what their experiences were and what they've been through will have an impact on what goes on in that classroom. If all we're focusing on is academics, we'll miss it.
I think that's so important. And I wrote down those questions because I'm going to ask my staff. I think those are questions that all educators need to be asking each other, because you're right. There are going to be teachers that there's already an achievement gap. We know that. And I'm in a lower income, higher needs school. So there's already a gap there for a variety of reasons. And I can see the urgency with some teachers of like, oh my goodness, this gap is getting bigger. So it kind of leads me to the next question that was submitted.
Before we go on, I want to hear the question, but I've always said that development marches at its own pace in each individual kid. I think there are so many people out there who think that through sheer force of will, they can speed up development. Whatever walks back into your classroom when this is all over, development is still marching at its own pace. That kid is at where that kid is at. You may want to push that kid further than that kid can really go. And I'm all about high expectations. So this is not, and the minute people hear that, they immediately think he's lowering expectations. Nope. All I'm saying is you've got to have expectations, but you've got to meet each kid where they're at, because development marches at its own pace. And the biggest disasters I see between kids and caregivers is when adults are trying too hard to push the envelope on development marching at its own pace. Sorry for the interruption.
No, that is so powerful. And it's true. And kids develop at different paces, right? And you're everything is kind of smacking me in the face, because I started kindergarten at 4 years old, right? I graduated high school when I was 17 years old. I wasn't ready to be out of school, right? Developmentally, I just wasn't. And so I'm hearing what you're saying. I think that's powerful. And I think it goes back to looking what we're asking kids to do in kindergarten, right? When we need to go back to those core values of what we know a 5-year-old needs to be doing. But instead, we're hammering academics because we've got to get them caught up or we've got to get them there.
earlier and earlier and earlier. And here's a truth. This is guaranteed. The higher you set the bar developmentally, the more kids are going to fall off the apple cart. Guaranteed.
So that leads me to this question. How do you see equity in regards to race, economics, all of these pieces fitting into your work? Because I think that's important.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think that my definition of what classroom teachers need to bring to the job, got to have expectations. Cannot run a classroom without expectations. Those expectations got to be realistic given what's walking in the door. And when a kid is having difficulty meeting a particular expectation, got to work with that kid collaboratively and proactively to deal with it. That cuts across race, that cuts across socioeconomic status. And by the way, you're not just doing that with the kids who are most likely to disrupt the classroom process, although they may be your top priority in the beginning, because those are the kids we are presently losing. It is very equitable and very comforting to kids to know, because you've modeled it and they've seen you doing it. If there's an expectation that I'm having difficulty meeting in this classroom, I will be heard. My teacher's going to meet with me. I'm not in trouble. No one's mad at me. And we're going to figure this out together. That's equity when you're doing it for every kid.
And I think those words that you just said are words kids need to hear. Is, I need to hear from you. We're going to work through this. You're not in trouble. And we're going to figure it out. Right. And I think just that simply, some kids, that in itself is the foundation of that child being us being skill driven and building the child's skill where those problems are lying.
Correct.
And we don't, and it's so interesting. We don't ask kids. And traditionally in schools, we don't ask kids what the problem is.
Right.
And you speak of this in your book so highly of like adults just project what the problem is and we come up with the solution. And it may not even be close to what the problem is.
That's correct.
And so, as I said, I know I could talk to you for days and I want to value your time. So I'm going to ask you the last question that I ask every guest. And it is, what do you want the educators out there to know? What do you want to know about their work and their impact? Just what do you want them to know?
Number one, I feel your pain. You've had some things, in the words of Larry David, foisted on you. That was a good episode, by the way.
That was good.
You've had some things foisted on you that did not help you be the educator you wanted to be, and that forced you to conduct your classroom in a certain way. Which is why so many classroom teachers have said to me, they've taken all the humanity out of my job. It's time to put the humanity back in the job. The academics will not suffer by you teaching kids how to listen, by you modeling it for them, and by teaching kids how to collaborate with each other and with you, solving problems. That's the message.
And it's a key message. And it's one that educators need to give themselves what we call pre-forgiveness and permission to do human work, because we're not producing data points. We're not producing test scores. We're producing kids, human beings that are going to walk this earth for forever as educators, and one generation after another. And I think humanizing what we do is imperative. And I think if we're going to disrupt a system after this pandemic, it has to be in that space. We've seen some of the most amazing human interactions happening right now in crisis, from people jumping in at nursing homes, from people helping neighbors, from people, and the ironic part is some of it is from a distance. Mm-hmm. So imagine what we can do together closely over time. And that is why I'm insanely optimistic for us coming out of this pandemic stronger as people and as educators. So Dr. Greene, thank you so much for being on here. And I want people to be able to know about where they can access you, your work, So will you share your website and your social media so they can connect?
The big website is the website of my nonprofit, Lives in the Balance. It's lives, L-I-V-E-S, in the balance.org. Massive amounts of free information on that website about how to do what we've been talking about. There is the documentary film, The Kids We Lose, which is an expose of what we're still doing to kids with social, emotional, and behavioral challenges here in the year 2020. They didn't okay. That's at thekidswelose.com. And there is a new website, truecrisisprevention.org. Just launched it. When did we launch it? Today's Wednesday. I think we launched it on Monday. So it's a hot off the press website filled with free resources. There's nothing to buy about how to help schools dramatically reduce their use of restraint and seclusion, not by managing crises, but by preventing them. Lots of free stuff out there for people. It's all there for the taking. Take it.
And before we recorded, I thanked you, and I want to thank you publicly on this for the amount of free resources you provide, because it is the catalyst that thousands of people across this country and even internationally are using to provide support for kids. And I can't thank you enough, because I've been on your website. I've pulled a lot of your resources and I value them. So thank you for providing that to the educators out here that we need those resources. So thank you. So for all of the listeners, thank you for listening. I know you are going to be excited to follow all of Dr. Greene's work and his website. But if you would like to follow me as well, I am on Principal List on Twitter and also Instagram, and Matthew Portell on Facebook. And as an update, we are at this current time still going to host our Disruptors Unite conference, which is the Trauma Informed Educators Network conference in July, late July here in Nashville. Please stay on the social media to see any updates on any cancellations. But thank you again. And as always, be safe out there and wash your hands.